Professor Richard Youngs, thank you very much for joining our interview series. Let me start right away with the first question. How should we analytically distinguish the present cycle of democratic regression from previous waves of autocratization? Does this moment represent merely a quantitative intensification or a qualitatively novel form of democratic decay tied to identity conflict, digital transformation, and transnational illiberalism?
I think you answered your own question there with the last two factors that are really the distinguishing features of the current phase of autocratization. Not every factor is new. These things move in political cycles. Many of the strains affecting democracy are fairly constant across time. We shouldn't overly idealize previous periods when democracy seemed to be on the up. Many of these problems are of long-standing nature, but I think the two factors you identify are those that do seem to herald some kind of qualitative shift, the aspect of digital technology and the structural shifts in global order and the way that they impinge upon national level politics. I would say that both those factors, the digital sphere and the international order, are both factors whose impact is still fairly fluid and might be quite complex over the medium term. The digital sphere, as we know, has very negative implications for democracy, and on all focuses on the negative side at the moment. If one looks back some years, there was a hope that the digital technology might also have some kind of democratizing impact as well. I think if governments do get on top of adequately regulating the online information space, then some of the focus might shift back to hopefully some of the more positive aspects of digital technology. And the same with the international order. I think all experts realize that we're in an interregnum between the liberal global order and whatever comes to replace it. And it's not actually certain at the moment what kind of order will come next. And clearly that international order will give greater place and weight to non-democratic powers, but there are still many democratic powers that might coordinate more effectively in the future to ensure that democracy does still have some kind of place in the newly reshaped global order.
Right. To what extent is the rise of radical right populism in Europe driven by structural cleavages, cultural, socioeconomic, geopolitical, versus strategic agency on part of populist entrepreneurs? How should we interpret this ascent within broader theories of party system realignment?
So this is a long-standing debate, but again, I think the answer is there implicit in your question. I would say that the strategic agency deployed on the part of illiberal policy entrepreneurs is the really significant factor. I think these underlying structural issues, those we've just talked about on the technology side and the shift in global politics, the economic factors, the identity factors are all there. I don't think there's any one factor that can be applied to all cases. The balance between these different causal drivers clearly varies between different states. But if one recognizes that there's no underlying structural factor that can be employed to explain really uniform structural tendencies, then I think the focus has to come to rest on what you refer to as the strategic agency, the leadership tactics, and the very skillful way in which many leaders have deployed incremental tactics to undermine democratic quality, even if not taking politics in a wholesale authoritarian direction, nibbling away at the quality and robustness of democratic checks and balances. So I would say it's a combination of underlying structural features with more political agency, and as you intimate, it's the interreaction between the two levels that has made the current wave of autocratization so potent.
Right. You have written about an emerging illiberal international. Are today's authoritarian and illiberal leaders like Putin, Erdogan, Orban, Trump converging around a coherent ideological project, or are we observing a more fluid assemblage of mutually reinforcing but heterogeneous illiberalisms?
I think the alliances are more fluid. Again, as you suggest, we know many books and articles have been written on this emerging coordination between authoritarian regimes. I think there's a general consensus that um, these regimes are coordinating more effectively. Part of that coordination is their pushback against liberal or democratic norms in many places of the world, but they do not share a uniform agenda. Many of the illiberal projects are quite distinctive, quite different in their ideological precepts and what they, the kind of policies that they prioritize. The differences at the moment don't seem to preclude some degree of coordination, but there clearly isn't um, one single well-coordinated policy of autocracy promotion in the way that democracies have sought to coordination in previous years. So it's clearly significant. It's clearly an important emerging aspect of global politics. But I think one needs to be careful not to overestimate just how coherent a bloc the non-democratic regimes have established, at least to date.
Right. Uh, can you can you please put yourself in the middle of the screen, Professor? Yes, great. What does the partial autocratization of the United States under Trump imply for global democratic theory? Does it signal the end of assumption that consolidated democracies are inherently resilient, or does it reflect deeper path dependencies in presidential majoritarian systems?
So I think Trump in himself shows that consolidated democracies are not inherently resilient. I think that fact has been emerging and clear for quite some time over the last decade. I think it's another lurch in that direction, perhaps the most dramatic and worrying to date, but I think it's the intensification of a trend that we've been seeing over the last decade rather than something qualitatively new. I think what could represent a game changer is the fact that internationally, the US does seem to have moved from being an anchor of democratic order to being a supporter of many forms of authoritarian government, not everywhere, but as the US steps back, at least in many places, from supporting democratic norms, I think that may change the balance in this battle between democracy and autocracy, and it will represent a significant factor um, militating against democratic reform in many countries. One should not overestimate the impact of what's going on in the US. In many countries around the world, democracy's fate will depend still on very locally rooted factors, not on what's going on in the US. But I do think this is a significant shift that will have implications, especially for the international dimensions of democratic theory.
Right. How do you assess the relative weight of institutional capture, courts, media regulators, security agencies, versus cultural political radicalization in driving democratic reconsolidation? Is one a precursor to the other, or do they typically evolve in mutually reinforcing spirals?
Again, you answer your own very good question. I think both the formal institutional level and the more social cultural levels are significant, and then it's the way that they have increasingly reinforced each other in recent years that has given a lot of momentum to the current illiberal wave. It seems to me that in some countries it's the institutional side that comes first and has driven changes at the social level. In other countries, it's the other way around. So there's no uniform pattern, as I was saying, across countries. But it seems to me that it's the coexistence of both these formal institutional dynamics and the evolution of dynamics at the social and cultural level that are so interesting and represent such a powerful trend.
Given the EU's increasing reliance on counter disinformation, surveillance resilience, and digital shields, do you see a danger that defensive democracy morphs into a form of technocratic securitization that paradoxically narrows democratic space?
I think the danger is there. Of course, your question is very topical at the moment because the EU just agreed its European Democracy Shield and the inception of a European Center for Democratic Resilience last week. You are correct at the moment. The priority focus does seem to be on shielding European democracy in a very defensive way from FIMI operations, from foreign influence and manipulation operations, from external sources. At the same time, European policymakers do, at least rhetorically, recognize that this is only a limited part of the equation of what is necessary to shore up European democratic norms. The remit of the shield has shifted somewhat. So there is slightly more of a focus on civic engagement, media pluralism than was originally evident, in part in recognition that many people, as you were just suggesting, have raised concerns about the EU perhaps itself drifting into a slightly illiberal technocratic securitization in the name of defending liberal democracy. So I think that warning is clearly on the EU agenda. I think policymakers are aware of that. And hopefully what will happen is that the Democracy Shield and the new centre will move into a democracy strategy that is balanced between, on the one hand, the regulations and laws that are needed to genuinely needed to shield European democracy from harmful online and external influences, but also more of a positive dynamic of civic empowerment, upon which democratic quality also depends in the medium to longer term.
Right. What evidence do we have that autocratizing incumbents actively learn from one another's tactical repertoires, judicial interference, NGO restrictions, electoral manipulation, and how should the EU conceptualize this diffusion of illiberal techniques?
There's lots of evidence, I'm sure, as you know, and you've worked on in the centre, that regimes are learning from each other on these tactics. In some cases, they're almost copying and pasting the same kinds of repressive laws taken from other countries into their own legislations. There's ample evidence of this. This is not a new issue now. It's been going on for 15 years. We're almost in the second, third iteration of these repressive laws, and the international dynamics, the lessons that regimes are learning from each other are clearly stronger than they were some years ago. I think the lesson for actors like the EU is that this assault on democratic space across the world is not any longer an issue simply of trying to protect individual civil society organizations in a select number of cases. It's something that exists at a more systemic level internationally, and it needs to be conceived of and tackled at that level. The EU has begun to move in that direction, but still has quite a way to go, I think, to understand the really order level significance of this kind of anti-democratic learning across borders.
Right. You have described a tension whereby insulating the EU from radical right influence risks constraining pluralism, while integrating them risks legitimizing illiberalism. How should scholars and policymakers evaluate this democracy catch-22 in light of the long-term risks to both the polity and the party system?
I don't have an answer to this. I conceptualized it as a catch-22 situation, as has many other people done, because I just don't think there's a good, perfect option for European policymakers. Engagement with far-right parties clearly risks normalizing such parties to an undue extent, but on the other hand, ostracizing them completely risks actually increasing their appeal for a significant part of the population. I think we're in a gray zone at the moment where the fact that in many countries these parties have gained such a significant part of the vote, it's not so easy to ignore them completely anymore. But most mainstream parties are still reluctant to build them informally into any working partnerships. And the far right parties, the radical parties themselves, now have to juggle with a difficult strategic decision themselves, whether to engage in normalized politics or whether to hold themselves outside the system and retain their appeal as extra institutional challenger parties. And we see some of these difficulties, for example, in the Netherlands over the last 4 or 5 months. So I think we're at the moment, I would conceptualize it as an rather uneasy grey area of adjustment at the moment, somewhere between far-right parties being left out and ostracized completely, and other parties wanting to deal with them as completely normal parties. It's a very uneasy combination. It's a kind of implicit attempt to get around this catch-22, but I'm not sure we can expect really dramatic results from this. And I think mainstream parties will continue to struggle how to deal with this phenomenon at the moment.
Right. Is Europe's push for strategic autonomy compatible with maintaining a robust external democracy support agenda, or does the logic of autonomy inevitably push the EU toward transactional geopolitics and away from normative liberalism?
I don't think it pushes the EU inevitably towards purely transactional geopolitics, but there clearly are significant signs at the moment that the EU is prioritizing other policy issues over democracy support. European democracy support is still there, it still exists. It has not collapsed dramatically yet, but there are signs that many member states, or at least some member states, are cutting their democracy budgets, are prioritizing more strategic alliances with non-democratic regimes. So again, at the moment, we have a rather uneasy balance where some aspects of the democracy agenda are being strengthened in the name of the EU's geopolitical interests, but many elements of it are also being weakened because of this pursuit of more realpolitik like geopolitics. It's an uneasy balance again. I think that uneasy balance is likely to exist in the future. I think that you will come out of this period of adjustment with some degree of commitment to democracy support still existing, but it will look like a quite different democracy support agenda than existed 5 or 10 years ago.
Right. With US democracy assistance dramatically reduced, is the EU institutionally and ideationally equipped to serve as the central node of a reconfigured global democracy support ecosystem? Or does this require a paradigmatic rethinking beyond funding substitution?
The latter. And we have just written with my Carnegie colleagues on this. I think what's happened with the US cuts in democracy support, although some of the democracy aid now has been reconstituted, but still the cuts are very significant, very severe, and it's acting as a catalyst for other democracies around the world to rethink their policies, including many European donors. I think there is a recognition that a broader set of alliances needs to be built with democracies outside Europe. The EU is not going to step up on its own fully to compensate for the cuts in US democracy assistance. Many member states are, for their own reasons, cutting development assistance. So that is also prompting them to look different ways to support democratic reformers that are not so heavily dependent on the standard project aid, as has been the case in the past. I think, again, the democracy agenda will still exist, but it will have to exist. It will have to go through quite a significant degree of change. That means for the EU, the debate cannot simply be about how far the EU can compensate for the cuts in United States aid. What we're seeing in the US presents the challenge of the democracy community as a whole having to really think afresh and think that the democracy agenda will need to be more selective, pursued in different ways. It won't have the same kind of primacy, I think, in global politics as it did in the past, even if it doesn't die out completely.
Right. Your work on the triple nexus highlights interlocking vulnerabilities. Should democratic governance now be treated as a central security variable in EU climate and conflict policy rather than a parallel track? What institutional reforms would this require?
Exactly. Again, you posed the policy imperative very well. We have the democracy agenda, we have the conflict agenda, we have the climate agenda. All these three intensifying in complexity. The challenges represented from each of those three agendas are becoming more severe, but at the moment they are pursued largely as parallel tracks in European policy, and they're very difficult, thorny challenges to try and bring them together and to understand better how conflict intersects with climate change, how climate intersects with governance challenges and governance intersects with conflict dynamics, and for the EU to pursue policies and initiatives and projects on the ground that encompass all three of these dynamics together. Again, the EU rhetorically does seem to agree that this is necessary. Formally, it's introduced several strategy documents that talk about how important this move is. But I think institutionally, the funding structures and foreign policy security structures are not really there yet in a way that enables governments and EU institutions to approach these different challenges as a singular policy challenge.
Right. In your recent work, you suggest moving from analyzing autocratization to theorizing democratic resilience. How should resilience be conceptualized so that it doesn't simply mean institutional survival, but also normative renewal, adaptability, and democratic deepening?
Again, that's exactly the answer. Lots of people now are writing on democratic resilience. For more than a decade, the focus has mainly been on democratic backsliding, autocratization. More people are now trying to get to grips with the reasons why some democracies do seem to have survived in reasonably good shape from all the challenges over the last decade. In a small number of cases, even some countries have made democratic improvements. That is why the concept of resilience does seem to be more prominent now. It means different things to different people. Part of it is about pure survival, fending off very overt authoritarian dynamics. But the second layer, increasingly analysts have recognized, is that to survive, democracy does not need to simply fend off Chinese, Russian, whatever threats externally. Democracy needs to reform itself. There are debates about this, what kind of democratic reform can provide most resilience over the longer term. The debates are still quite embryonic, but I think they're beginning to filter into policy debates. The degree of resilience we see, I think, is still quite fragile, quite tentative. No, but I do think we will need in future years, we will need a much tighter learning process from these emerging analytical debates about democratic resilience on the one hand, and the design of better democracy resilience strategies on the part of the EU and other actors on the other hand. There's some overlap and some progress being made, but at the moment it's still quite limited. I think even though a lot of the policy focus will need to be on dealing with continued trends in authoritarianism, there also, in parallel to that, will need to be a more systematic focus on democratic resilience.
Right. Your research identifies patterns in democratic recoveries like Brazil, Poland, Zambia, Senegal. What distinguishes successful recovery trajectories from cases where post-authoritarian openings stagnate or relapse? Which factors, elite coalition, civil society autonomy, constitutional design, matter most?
So you refer to a big report we've just done presenting a number of these cases that did seem to present at particular moments an opportunity for democratic recovery. The sobering reality is that when these moments of democratic opportunity opened up, relatively few of the countries then saw a really far-reaching definitive process of re-democratization. Most of them struggled to implement full democratic reforms. There was pushback against the attempt to re-democratize. The whole challenge of re-democratization is very, very difficult because it requires newly empowered democratic regimes to take back control of state institutions that have been captured by anti-democratic forces. I don't think there's any single, because there's been so few cases of absolutely resounding success, there's no easy factors to isolate and say that successful democratic recovery really depends on A, B, or C. But we have noticed that in general, where There is strong societal mobilization and pressure linked together with reformers within the political sphere through competitive political parties, and at the institutional level, then the momentum towards democratic reform after sustained periods of autocratization does seem to be stronger. But I would say that in general, these cases of potential positive turnaround do tell us that it's much easier to undo democracy than to reassemble good quality democratic norms. Rebuilding democracy is a really hard enterprise, and even with governments with the strongest will in the world to try and redemocratize institutionally, socially, this just can be very, very difficult to do.
Right. And lastly, Professor Youngs, your proposal for a European Democracy Pact aims to separate political system norms from policy disputes. What would constitute a sufficiently rigorous and enforceable set of democratic red lines to test parties' commitment to liberal pluralism without collapsing into moralism or partisan exclusion?
I think that's what needs to be defined. It's very complicated, but I think what is needed is to kind of prize apart the rather illiberal policy agendas of far-right parties in Europe that one may profoundly disagree with, but they might not in themselves be inherently anti-democratic. One needs to separate out those policy positions from what are genuine threats to the core institutional norms of democracy. I think at the moment those two things get rather conflated with each other. At one extreme, people would say that these parties are kind of inherently and unavoidably fully anti-democratic. Others would say they simply have policies that liberals may dislike, but they're not a danger to democracy. The truth is probably somewhere in between those two extremes, but I think the need is to have a clear agenda of what at the institutional level is anti-democratic behavior, to separate out the issue of particular kinds of illiberal social values on the one hand from what is core democratic politics on the other hand. There will, I think, unavoidably be some gray area in making this distinction, but what I suggested with this proposal for a democracy pact is to try and prize away some of the areas of rising conservatism, whose policies may be rather illiberal and one may disagree with, but might be made to join together in some kind of joint commitment to core democratic norms.
Professor Richard Youngs, thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.